Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the third meeting of Language Identity Workshop. My name is Naoko Hosokawa. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College, and I'll be moderating the event today. Before starting the event, let me remind you that there is a live Japanese to English interpretation. So if you'd like to hear this lecture in Japanese, you can use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Japanese. And also let me remind you that this is a lecture portion of the event, and there is a workshop portion of the event immediately following this event. And they have a different Zoom links for two separate events. So please use another Zoom link to participate in the workshop portion of the event. So today we have Dr. Kayoko Hashimoto from University of Queensland in Australia. And Dr. Hashimoto is a senior lecturer at School of Language and Cultures. And her main research area is language policy with particular interest in Japanese and English language teaching in Asia and Australia. And her publications include Asian Studies Review, Special Issue, Japan and Southeast Asia, Language Mobility and Employability, an edited book, Japanese Language and Soft Power in Asia, and a co-authored book, Beyond Native Speakerism, Current Exploration and Future Visions. So today, Dr. Hashimoto will give us a lecture entitled Japan's Language Policy and Assumptions about the Learner Identities. Promotion of English language teaching for Japanese and Japanese language teaching for foreigners. If you have a question you'd like to ask Dr. Hashimoto, you can use Q&A function at any point of the lecture, so you don't have to wait until the end of the lecture. And after the lecture, I will introduce your questions to Dr. Hashimoto. So now we will give the floor to Dr. Hashimoto. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dr. Hosokawa. I'm delighted to be with the audience of the workshop at Tokyo College today. April is the month of cherry blossom and school and university entrance ceremony in Japan. And it is autumn in the Southern Hampshire here, Brisbane, Australia. At the University of Queensland, today is the first day after the mid-semester break of the first semester, which started in February. As I will mention later, in relation to my research project on Australia and Vietnam, this geographical location, being in an English-speaking country, Australia, in the Asian Pacific region, has shaped my personality as a researcher to explore Japan's language policy. I'm conscious that this talk is simultaneously interpreted by interpreters in Japanese. I really appreciate such arrangement, and I will speak a little bit slowly today, so please be patient with me. I'd like to share my PowerPoint with you now. Presentation PowerPoint, I hope it's okay.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad it works. Okay, I'd like to start. Okay, as this title says, the focus of today's talk is assumptions about language learner identities. When I was initially approached about the talk on English language education and Japanese identity, I thought I could look at Japan's language policy for both English language teaching for Japanese language for Japanese people and Japanese language teaching for foreigners by shedding new light on pedagogical issues as a common thread. I will argue that learner identities are inseparable from pedagogical issues and have significant impact on language policy implementation. In today's talk, firstly, I would like to situate the issue of learner identity in the current climate of debate about fluid relationships between language and identity. Then I will discuss pedagogical issues in relation to learner identities, followed by some examples of Japan's promotion of English language teaching for Japanese people and Japanese language teaching for foreigners. In the field of language policy and planning and language studies, there used to be a dominant conceptual framework that is based on assumptions that national identity has fixed meaning, and there is a direct link between language and identity that place the individual speaker in ethnic and national categories. The model of one language, one people, and one nation is no longer applicable in the era of globalization and transnational migration. And in many cases, the instrumental view of language as an economic asset seems to replace the traditional view of language as emblem of national identity. However, as some scholars point out, it is a rather complex process. People are not necessarily abandoning ethnocultural or nationalist attachment to languages, but recasting ideas and values attached to languages that derive from the nation-state paradigm. Perhaps one such example is a recent identity shift in wartime Ukraine, where citizenship has been increasingly seen as a focus of identity rather than ethnicity and language. In the era of globalization and transnational migration, which has brought about fluid relationships between language and identity, national identity is often multilingual and multicultural, and languages embodied constantly changing cultural, social, and political identity. Then, how does this affect the way we interpret Japan's language policy in education? Before we examine details of Japan's language policy, we like to share the recent newspaper coverage of Japan's English education with you, because they highlight some of current issues surrounding English language teaching in Japan. Both are Nikkei online articles written in Japanese, but the English translation and explanation are mine. Both articles report on this unsuccessful and ineffective English language teaching in relation to the impact on Japan's competitiveness in the international community. Given that Japan's so-called English education is one of the most hotly debated and researched topics in Japan for the last 4 decades or so, it is curious that the lack of or worsening English proficiency of Japanese people is attributed to the decline of national power, and that Japan's unique and outdated teaching method is partly blamed for the failure. One relatively new aspect features in the November article is the International Baccalaureate, which has been promoted as part of the plan to develop so-called global human resources. As the Nikkei is a financial newspaper, it is understandable that English language proficiency is discussed in terms of national asset for economic growth. But it also demonstrates that lack of interest in real people who teach or learn English in the current education system. In the field of language policy and planning, the relationships between macro-level policy planning and micro-level implementation of language policies have been studied extensively. Teachers are the agents who implement language policies at the micro level, but often there is silence on pedagogical issues at macro level. As a result, pedagogical issues are largely delegated to teachers. And yet, teachers are the easy target of blame for failed policy implementation. Some studies find that de facto practices can occur even when language policy is in place. And language tests are such an example of de facto policy practices. In the case of Japan, the government policy statements that promote communicative approaches to English language teaching are eschewed by the de facto educational practices, which are influenced by the university entrance examination. In recent years, the impact of language testing and assessment on individuals who are subject to policy controls has been examined by scholars in relation to citizenships and immigration. These studies suggest that we also need to understand social, cultural, and political aspects of teaching methods, because teachers tend to choose teaching methods that are suitable for themselves as well as for learners to maximize their performance at language tests and assessment. Before we look at teaching methodology of Japan's English language teaching, I would like to draw your attention to how English has been taught as a foreign language in Japan and how English is the de facto foreign language, dominating the foreign language curriculum. As English has spread to many parts of Asia, it has replaced local and indigenous languages other than national languages. In the case of Japan, it has contributed to eliminating other foreign languages from the curriculum. The majority of students have little opportunity to learn languages other than English, and more importantly, this enhances the dichotomic view, Japanese versus foreigners, Japan versus the rest of the world, and the Japanese language versus the English language. The latest senior high school course of study for English specified that teaching materials must help learners to develop their understanding of Japanese culture and the underlying cultures of the English language. In Japan, the course of study is binding, and all textbooks are written following the course of study. The English version of the document is available only for the English subject, presumably for non-Japanese English teachers who do not read Japanese. They also publish the guideline of the course of study for teachers, which is only available in Japanese. In this slide, the emphasis and English translation of guideline are mine. It is rather peculiar that Japanese culture is emphasized in the section of teaching materials of English. It does make sense, however, if the goal of teaching English to Japanese youth is to equip them with English language skills to promote Japan to the world. The original Japanese word, our country, presents a sense of nationalism, and the dichotomic view of the world enhances the simplistic classification of people and culture, as if Japanese people should have a Japanese way of thinking just because they are Japanese. This could be interpreted as a national strategy to fight against the wave of globalization, which is symbolized by the spread of English. In terms of individual language learners, however, this monolistic strategy is rather questionable, partly because it imposes the national collective identity on individual identity, which could be quite complex, and partly because it prevents learners from mastering the language for their personal growth in that changing world. The next slide shows some distinct aspects of teaching methodology of Japan's English language teaching. As it is criticized in the Nikkei article, it is a popular rhetoric that the outdated reading and writing focus approach to teaching is a cause of the failure. The reading and writing approach is also described as grammar translation method, which is opposed to the communicative approach. Although language proficiency is multi-componential and grammar contributes to overall language proficiency, the grammar translation method has been continuously positioned as a major obstacle to communicative approaches to English language teaching in Japan. In the field of translation and interpreting studies, however, the role of translation and interpreting in language acquisition has been revisited. And some argue that by using L1, learners take control of learning process, and therefore L1 does not need to stand in the way of L2 acquisition. The Japanese government has promoted communicative approaches mainly to increase learners' speaking ability, which is known as the conducting English classes in English approach. The method was fully implemented in 2013 in the senior high school curriculum. In the latest version of course of study, the approach is stated in the section of language activities. Clearly, it is different from the English as a medium of instruction approach, as the main purpose is to increase opportunities to expose students to English, not to eliminate Japanese language from classroom. It does not extend to teaching materials or assessment either. Interestingly, the conducting classes in English statement is followed by the statement of collaboration with Japanese language teachers, which is rather confusing. In the English version of the course of study, it is collaboration with Japanese language teachers, but the original Japanese reads as collaboration with the National Language Department. The difference is crucial because such an arrangement is between departments, not between teachers. The guideline further explains that since both subjects aim at improving language ability, they could share some of the teaching contents and methods. It is rather astonishing that the national language teaching and English language teaching are discussed at the same level, particularly when English is positioned as a foreign language, not a community language in Japan. In the heavy emphasis on Japan and Japanese language, it will be difficult for learners to imagine themselves as an English speaker. In terms of collaboration, the course of study mentions native speakers twice for their role for voice instruction, which is similar to audiovisual equipment and as a listening and speaking partner. This kind of description of native speakers for their functions, rather than an individual person who embodies the language and culture, demonstrates the instrumental view of English speakers. ALTs, or assistant language teachers of the JET program, are mentioned only once as an example of native speakers in the guideline of the senior high school course of study. Since ALTs are not qualified teachers, they are only allowed to teach in the form of team teaching with Japanese teachers. But such a well-promoted teaching method is not mentioned at all, even in the guideline of the course of study. While the JET program has been seen as a successful model of Japan's diplomacy, the concept of team teaching has presented problems for both Japanese teachers and ALTs, as it does not recognize either of them as an independent teacher with their own skills. How about the impact on the learners? What kind of messages does it send to learners to become a speaker of English? As I have discussed, Japan's English language teaching paradoxically takes its concern with a broader framework of the promotion of the Japanese language. Within this framework, native speakers of foreign languages are treated only as a useful tool. Learning to articulate Japanese ideas forms a necessary basis for the learning of foreign languages, and this requires international audiences for the dissemination of Japan's distinctiveness. Such international audiences could be Japanese language learners, who are described as Japanese language human resources by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In other words, the instrumental view of foreigners is common to both English language teaching and Japanese language teaching. Actually, the JET program is an interesting case to reflect such a view, because JET participants themselves are both English speakers and Japanese language learners. As the name of the program, Japan Exchange and Teaching suggests, it is mainly a teaching program in Japan, but teaching qualification and a high level of Japanese language proficiency are not required, although they are given additional consideration in the case of ALT applicants. One requirement is to be adept in contemporary standard pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation in the language, which echoes the role of native speakers described in the senior high school course of study. Interestingly, the first eligibility criterion is to be interested in Japan and will be willing to deepen their knowledge and appreciation of Japan after their arrival. It is a rather strange practice to list being interested being interested as a selection criterion, because such interest cannot be measured in a concrete manner. While it seems to be the most important quality of foreigners for the program, the application process also reveals a one-dimensional understanding of applicants. The 2023 application form asks applicants to evaluate their foreign language proficiency. Apart from Japanese and their native language, this seems to assume that applicants' native language is English if they are applying from English-speaking countries, and other languages are foreign language to them. In multicultural and multilingual countries, such as Australia, the definition of native language is often tricky for migrant background people, because their fluency is determined by education, not by native or non-native status. The one-dimensional interest in foreigners, or the instrumental view of them, is also reflected in the teaching methodology of Japanese language. In 2019, the Agency of Cultural Affairs published a report on development and training of human resources for Japanese language education. The report is available only in Japanese, and English translation on these slides are mine. It is an extensive report of over 100 pages with 3 sections. The first one is current issues surrounding Japanese language, education, human resources. And the second part is required and qualities and abilities of the teachers. And the third one is about development and training contents. Teaching methods as mentioned twice in the training contents. It only states teaching method suitable for learning items. And no words are found in relation to the medium of instruction. Although the report acknowledges increasing number of foreigners with diverse backgrounds arriving in Japan and a high demand for Japanese language learning overseas, the human resources for Japanese language education that the agency wants to develop are native speakers of Japanese. It is assumed that they teach Japanese in the direct method, using Japanese as a medium of instruction. In the section of the qualities and abilities required for Japanese teachers going abroad, 2 items are referred to in terms of local languages. To have a knowledge of the language used in the country or region and a general knowledge of linguistic contrast between the language and Japanese. And another one is to be able to communicate using the local language. It does not require, however, that the teachers should be able to teach using the local language in classroom. Since local teaching qualifications are required to teach in school setting and in many countries in the world, this report seems to target Japanese teachers who will be dispatched overseas through Japanese government or related organization for a short-term posting. But I believe it is still important to train teachers about different teaching methods to prepare them for their overseas posting, because different approaches are based on different views of teaching, as well as different ways to relate to the learners. Any teaching methods have pros and cons, and the reason to adopt a certain method could be an innocent one, such as the lack of a common language among learners, but ultimately, it has a significant impact on learners' relationships with teachers and the language. The direct method, which is used by most Japanese native speakers teachers in Japan, is teacher-oriented. During the occupation by the Empire of Japan, it was developed to make the Japanese language their mother tongue by eliminating other languages. In other words, the teaching method was directly involved in their identity construction in the occupied territories. As I mentioned earlier, learners take control of the learning process by using their L1, their first language. And during the occupation period, such empowerment was obviously not desired by people who like to control them. Recently, the history of Japanese language teaching has been revisited, including teaching method by scholars, partly because of the influx of migrant workers in Japan due to the aging population and labor shortage. As the direct method completely ignores learners' linguistic and cultural backgrounds and do not provide them opportunities to negotiate their linguistic and cultural understanding in the learning space, surely it has an impact on their well-being in Japanese society. While in Japan, the central government and ministry control curriculum and the textbook of school education. In Australia, Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, which is an independent statutory authority, is responsible for development of a national curriculum and assessment program in collaboration with various stakeholders, such as federal and state governments, teachers, schools, and local communities. In the Australian curriculum, languages other than English is described as a second language or an additional language for learners, not a foreign language. It acknowledges diversity of language learners, including Japanese background students. And teachers are expected to cater for the range of different learner backgrounds and to personalize learning experiences for these students. This is in a stark contrast to Japan's course of study for English, which narrowly defines learners as Japanese nationals who will transmit Japanese words to the world without consideration for different backgrounds or learning experiences of individual learners. Consideration for individual differences among learners also reflects the way Japanese and English are explained in the Australian curriculum. In the curriculum for years 9 and 10, which are equivalent to Japan's junior high school third year and senior high school first year, Japanese is used by both learners and teachers extensively, and English is used for discussion, as well as analysis and reflection. It also states that by comparing, analyzing, and reflecting on their understanding of Japanese language and culture, and their own languages and cultures, they should be able to question their preconceived ideas about Western and Japanese values. I find this statement extremely important because it shows that language learning builds critical awareness of the world represented by the target language, as well as their own languages. In relation to critical awareness built through language learning, I would like to share some of the findings of my current project with Vietnamese universities, Hanoi University and Hue University. It started in 2021, funded by my university, University of Queensland, which is an extension of UQ Global Partnership Funding Scheme with Vietnam. It is partly based on my previous research with Vietnamese students of Hanoi University, which finds gaps between their personal aspiration and Japanese employers' expectation. While employability has been a buzzword in higher education in both Vietnam and Australia, in this project, we wanted to know how our students perceive the Japanese language program in relation to their individual trajectories. Data was collected from students of Japanese programs in their final year by online survey and Zoom interviews in Vietnamese for Vietnamese students and English for Australian students. Among 10 UQ students who were interviewed, 7 students spoke languages other than English and Japanese. 5 students claimed that they will have a better understanding of their cultural and linguistic backgrounds upon completion of their study. One of them is a Malaysian background student who is often misidentified as being not Australian, despite that she has grown up in Australia and has Australian citizenship. She stated that studying Japanese at the university allow her to have a better understanding of her culture and linguistic background by interrogating ideas about stereotypical Australian, Asian, or Japanese. Participants were also asked about topics they wish had been included in their Japanese study. And history was the most popular topic for both Australian and Vietnamese cohorts. They think learning history puts language study in context, and knowing both sides of stories helps them to understand the current political and economic situations. In relation to history, some embraces the idea of Asian civilization opposed to Western civilization through Japanese language study, which is an eye-opener for us. These are just preliminary findings, and we are preparing to produce a full report later this year. I'd like to stop here, and thank you very much for listening today. And these are the references.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hashimoto, for such an inspiring talk. So now I'd like to open the floor to questions. If you have any questions, please type your questions in the Q&A function, Q&A page, and I'll introduce a question. So I'd like to start with my own question. It's such an interesting topic that also speaks to me a lot. And especially I found the dichotomy between Japanese speaker and foreigners and Japanese and Japan and the rest of the world, and Japanese language and English language, that is very important issue about English teaching, English language education in Japan. So I'd like to ask you a question about the latest reform in 2020. I understand that they increased the number of hours of English classes, but also they increased the number of hours on Japanese culture and history. And when I looked at the latest textbooks, I realized that on one hand, we see a diversity among the characters on the textbook. So we do see characters who have double nationalities, who are not native speakers of English. So we do see more diverse personalities of the characters. But at the same time, I was also quite struck by the fact that there is a very strong focus on the Japanese culture and the structure of the narrative of Japanese speakers, introducing Japanese culture towards foreigners. So to you, does this reform mark any substantial change in the current status of the English teaching education in Japan? Or do you think it's just a confirmation of the existing problems in Japanese English language education? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great questions. And it's actually, your question shows two different aspects of movement surrounding language education. Like at the beginning, I said, you know, there are lots of debate and there's a fluidity about connection between language and identity. And we have seen lots of changes in Japan overseas, like there are lots of emphasis on diverse speaker, you know, or English speakers, and many people actually put a lots of effort. But at the same time, there is another power to try to bring it back. So there's always kind of, I don't call it not necessarily conflict, but it's a kind of balance. At the same time, try to bring, you know, diversity. But on the other hand, they still want to maintain the status quo. And in my talk, I describe it as a national strategy against power of globalization. So it's been ongoing the last 20 years. I was very interested in that because we shouldn't, you know, forget that Japan managed to have the linguistic independence, you know, after World War II compared to, you know, other countries in Asia. So there are lots of effort there, but at the same time, in order to keep it, there is a consequence. I think when I look at language policy for both English and Japanese, kind of constant actually, I'm not saying power struggle, but a different pull for both sides. And we really hope, you know, it really bring it to that right direction. One thing I couldn't include in my trade talk is recent announcement, probably late last year, they are going to change the purpose of technical trainees, you know, scheme. Initially, it was so-called good philosophy to educate foreigners and with new Japanese high-tech, you know, technology training, and eventually those people go back and contribute their own country. That's a so-called philosophy, we are told. But if we maintain the philosophy, then we are actually labeling those people forever temporal, you know, trainees, not other people who actually has a potentially, you know, settle in Japan and be part of Japanese community. So I don't really call it philosophy, but that's a kind of so-called beautiful diplomacy. It's actually prevent to really realize who actually we're dealing with. So that's I find the case is very interesting and hope that changes actually to really see who are dealing with and what we have to do for them. So going back to your original question, I recognize both sides of proof, but also particularly this labor shortage and aging population. We really want to have people come here. It's really important to understand who actually they are and what we can do. So that's my observation at this stage 2023. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting topic. And we have a couple of questions now. So I'll read the first question. So the first question is from Svetlana Nasakina. Thank you very much for your lecture. I am from Ukraine, and now English is becoming the language #1 in our country. What about the importance of English in Japan in comparison with the native language?
Native language means how I should mean national language. I assume.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. So thank you very much for the question. I mentioned a little bit in my talk, Ukraine's situation, and it's very politicized issue, and we are learning a lot, particularly in Australia. Actually, we have visitors in late June, and 3 Polish academics coming to talk about the impact of influx from people in Ukraine and how actually migration from Ukraine to Poland changed linguistic dynamics in the country. So this is quite a very political one, but compared to those very urgent issues you are facing in your country, at this moment, Japanese is not really threatened, I must say. So, but also Japanese language is the language which is only spoken mainly as official language in Japan. So many parts of the world, it's not used as a community language, but not, official or second or third language. So I'm not sure it has a clear connection between the power of language, but also Japan, it means Japan has the right to monopolize language teaching. One example is language testing, which I touched on, but I couldn't include detail in my talk today. For example, the Japanese language percentage, JLPT, that one hasn't been changed for ages. And many people outside Australia, including outside Japan, including Vietnam, they really want to have the test, which actually tests for skill, not just current to receptive skill. And since there is a kind of understanding Japanese belong to Japan, no other actually countries actually produce Japanese language proficiency test. And country like Vietnam, they are really keen to produce their own, testing system because it's very, very important to have actual applicable testing. Because for those people, Vietnamese people who go to Japan to work, those testing, it's very important. And then students study based on the testing requirement. So at the moment, the current language system is different, and therefore there is that creates issues in terms of testing one. So I'm not sure it's really answered your question, but importance in English in Japan in comparison in Japanese language, English is actually lingua franca. And in Japan, but you don't have to speak English, that's fine. So currently, I think for Japanese societies, more important thing is how actually train non-Japanese people Japanese language. That's my understanding, rather than importance of speaking English within Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have time for one quick question and answer. So I'll read the next question. I feel hugely intrigued by the relationship between the direct method in JFL education and imperialism. Would you please elaborate on this? And does the same linkage apply to other languages such as English?
Yep, thank you for the questions. I'm not the expert on the historical, study of Japanese language, but I recently really noticed some people actually raising the issue, particularly because we are facing the real issue. We have to train people from outside Japan, and we should be able to learn from our past. And of course, there are different debates about, for example, in order to do the dialect method, you really need native speakers. And if there are shortage of native speakers, it's impossible. So even in the same occupied Japan, it depends on countries. The situation in China, situation in Taiwan, China, Korea, it really depends on availability of teachers and translators and interpreters. So therefore, I mentioned that whether which method is employed is sometimes determined by convenience rather than ideology. But when we look back, it's similar to English, basically. For example, if you are native English speakers in Japan, you can live, you can obtain position without being fluent in Japanese. In similar logic, if under the occupied territories, like Japanese people do not have to speak local languages. So some people see the parallel and Japanese dominance in that kind of political climate and the English dominance in the current, climate. So there is a parallel there, but it actually, when we look back, when Japanese were taught in direct method, it's inevitably involves those identity issues of local people. So those people really suggest direct teaching method means what? So if we really cherish the people who are actually coming here, we should be able to understand who they are and not try to make them like Japanese people, but by understanding their linguistic and culture background, we should be able to train in different ways. So there is an effort to really learn from the past, and also at the same time, some resentment or understanding, not necessarily resentment, but understanding the power of English in the world. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. And I'm afraid we have to close this session now. Sorry for those who asked the question and I was not able to introduce. I will make sure to forward all the questions to Dr. Hashimoto. So now we will close this session and move to the workshop portion of this event. So if you have registered for the event, you have received the link. If not, a registration link is in the chat box, so you can register for the event and follow up with the events. And once again, thank you very much for joining us today. And please find the latest information of Tokyo College on the website, mail magazine, and social media. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you very much, Dr. Hashimoto.
Thank you very much.
See you later on another link.
Thank you.